Now, is from the Russians' perspective, is the argument that the threat to their national security is from the Ukraine's shelling in the Donbass region or from UN expansion into Ukraine?
It's all three.
NATO, not UN. Sorry.
It's all three. So there are constant attacks on the Donbass, and they're cutting off of essential services to the Donbass, and they're cutting off of essential services, including to Crimea. They shut down the water supply to Crimea. They dammed the river so they couldn't get access to water, and they had to find creative ways to deal with that. That was justified self-defense as to those regions. But in international self-defense, much like our domestic self-defense laws, we have proportionality requirements. And so going in to defend Crimea and the Donbass, the Russian government would be on stronger legal grounds, again, not getting into politics or morality of it. But going beyond that for regime change would only be justified if you could argue regime change is necessary for the self-defense of those two regions. Russia hasn't even argued that, really. Russia has argued they need regime change for two additional reasons, which is the commitment of Ukraine to seeking out nuclear weapons, which was based on President Zelensky's statement at the Munich Security Conference the weekend before Russia announced this military intervention. And secondly, Ukraine's repeated request to become part of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed originally in response to the Warsaw Pact, or to deal with the coming Warsaw Pact of Soviet powers, which has managed to survive after the Cold War, when some of us think that's kind of foolish. But putting that policy issue aside, they see NATO, a NATO nuclear-armed, partially Nazi-influenced regime, in anti-Russian regime in Ukraine, as a threat to their national security. And their position is, we can't wait for them to have NATO. We can't wait for them to have nuclear weapons, because if we do, it will be too late for us to protect our national security. This is very comparable to the Bush Doctrine arguments about the Second Iraqi War. And U.S. arguments, honestly, we've been using for over a century, including interventions in Central America and the Caribbean. And legally, I think I agree with the U.S. side. Now, I've often disagreed with the policy, but legally, I believe that the only question comes down is Russia right to see NATO nuclear-armed Ukraine as a threat to their national security under the current government of Ukraine? They have a lot of it. I believe if they had, there used to be the unaligned countries during the Cold War. They kind of still loosely exist. How unaligned they are, you can argue, because Yugoslavia was part of that. Cuba tried to be part of that. Not always, clearly they were unaligned, but putting that historical question aside, I think if you had completely neutral observers, that what you would likely on a jury, that you would not, definitely from a criminal perspective, you would not be able to show beyond a reasonable doubt that the Russians have no objective reason to believe their national security has been put at risk by West's interventions and policies under the current Ukrainian regime. I think from a civil perspective, it'd be a closer call, but we'll get a live vote on this week to some extent in the United Nations. The United Nations Security Council has already voted on a much watered-down resolution that doesn't even call what Russia did illegal. And despite that, not only, of course, Russia vetoed it, and unsurprisingly, China refused to support it, but somewhat surprisingly, the United Arab Emirates and India refused to support it. And it looks so far, it would not surprise me if a majority of countries amongst Latin America, Africa, and Asia do not even support this watered-down resolution this week, which tells you that people that have no real dog in the fight don't see this as black and white as many in the West do.
I'm just bringing this up. It's crazy. None of this Ukraine info has been said on any MSM. It is crazy, and that's when my flags go up. It's like, this strikes me as being exactly what we went through in the early stages of COVID, when Robert was saying, when everyone's doing this all in tandem, that's when your flags should be going up. But Robert, and one detail is that the Donbass region, they were not averse to separating from the Soviet Union, because they wanted to stop being under the fist of the Soviet Union. But their issue was then they just became under the fist of Kiev and Ukraine. And they said, we didn't trade oppression from the Soviets for oppression from Ukraine. And then I don't remember the year now, it was relatively recently, voted, like you said, to 2014 independent republics. And it was 90% that voted in favor of. Russia recognized it. Ukraine didn't, because they said, hey, we've got our borders from 1991-92, and we're not giving them up. Despite that, and there had been shelling from Ukraine against pro-Russian forces in Donbass. Oh gosh, are we still there?
Oh, well, yeah. And as an, can you hear me?
No,
yeah,
I can
so,
hear
I
you.
mean, as
Sorry
an
about that.
example, like there's some dispute about what was happening. The Western media pretended this Ukrainian military shelling wasn't occurring. Well, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has multiple European parties, but generally leans Western, has been on the ground monitoring it. And what they found was over 2,000 violations within 2 days of the ceasefire by the Ukrainian military in the weekend before Russia launched its attack. And so the Red Cross has also reported that the Ukrainian military had cut off essential services. In other words, things like water, sewage, gas, heat, you name it. So they, in violation of the Minsk Accords, and there's no dispute meaningfully that Ukraine has this Ukrainian government has taken no meaningful effort, despite the promises in Zelensky's election campaign, no meaningful effort to actually cooperate with the Minsk Accords, which required they deal directly with the people in Donetsk. And they've just refused. And I think it's Lugansk, the Donbass region. Those are the two separate republics. And so it's that combination that precipitated the Russian assault. Now, the question is whether two things, from a legal perspective, do they have objectively reasonable evidence that their national security was at risk to such a degree that it requires this kind of military intervention? And then secondly, will they actually, through military means, achieve this political objective? I personally, on the second one, have been a general skeptic, but I will say that if you study the broad contours of history, most nations have achieved their political objectives through military or martial means. So I'm not as a naive lefty, even though I'm a peacenik at heart, about the practicalities of it. But from a pure legality perspective, it is not. I think if they're in front of a neutral jury and I was setting odds, the Russians would likely win on their action being consistent with their self-defense interest. I think there's plenty of fair criticisms that that objectively they're wrong to conclude that about Ukraine being being a risk. And it also depends on whether you require the risk be imminent or not. U.S. used to, going back to, I think it's called the Caroline Doctrine, 1840s, that Canadian-British dispute. But again, we went away from that a long time ago. By the late 1890s, we abandoned that. And we said whatever's in our national security interest justifies military intervention in another region. So I think people who are critical of what Russia's done would be better served focusing on the morality and the politics of it, about war not being an effective means, whether their interpretation is objectively reasonable, at what point do they start experiencing too many collateral consequences to make it worthwhile. Now, I would note also in this other context, some international legal scholars interpret economic sanctions as acts of force and require the same thing from anybody imposing sanctions. I don't think the United States has a credible claim, or most of Europe has a credible claim of self-defense from Russia's military intervention in Ukraine. I do not believe that poses any real risk to the national security of the United States to justify any use of force, economic sanctions or otherwise, against them from a legal perspective.
Okay, and I'm getting to the other point you mentioned we should elaborate on. Zelensky was elected in 2015, right?
2018, I think.
2018. He was a comic, an actor, elected on the platform of negotiating peace in the East. And I forget exactly what
on the Russian and Ukrainians being one people. He sounded almost like Putin in his unification platform.
So, I mean,
he got a lot of Russian support in his election.
Well, and now my question is this. I think I know the answer that I'm giving to myself. What changed between his election in 2018 on that platform and now? And I can only put a dollar figure on it. And I'm thinking billions of dollars, aid coming in from the U.S., support coming in from the UN, where Zelensky all of a sudden says, I've got billions of dollars coming in to our country based on this threat with Russia. The cynic in me says, if I solve this problem, where does that aid go? Where does that billions of dollars? I don't know how much they've done over the last 5 years, but $1 billion over the last year. Where does that go? And also, in a fight, it's a regional dispute. Putin might be a bigger enemy or a stronger enemy than Ukraine. Typically, what would happen, though, is you'd negotiate along those lines. You would negotiate from a position of weakness versus a position of power. He ran on the position of reconciliation, then gets elected, and then the U.S. says, here's billions and billions of dollars. Where is Zelensky's incentive to actually resolve the dispute as opposed to continue promoting it? Because now he's got the U.S. and NATO and the UN behind him, and he thinks now he is negotiating from a position of power and can therefore renege on the election promises to negotiate peace. Is that wrong? Am I wrong in that thought process?
Yeah, no, I mean, if you look at what happens, this actually U.S. politics played a major role in this. So after Trump won, there was all Russiagate, and Russiagate was an intention, in my view, of sort of what you could call it the deep state, dual state, national security state, label it whatever you want, that they didn't want any sort of peace deal to be reached and with Russia. They're obsessively anti-Russian, Soros, EU, the WEF, these Bilderbergers, that whole crowd sees Russia as a major hindrance to their agenda, culturally, socially, economically, and politically. Putin has made clear he has no interest in unilateral government, unipolar power, anything like that, and is a culturally conservative. Went out of his way in his speeches to talk about this attack on the culture of the people of Russia, and he means woke politics being pushed by the EU and others, and by some of the U.S. hierarchy. But how it played in is when Trump says this wouldn't have happened under him, it's because Trump was trying to put afoot basically a version of a peace deal. Let's cooperate with Russia and focus on China, who's our main geopolitical adversary economically and politically in the future. And Russiagate made it very difficult for Trump to do that. And then the second thing is, in this particular context, Trump really tried to kickstart this by, after Zelensky got elected, called Zelensky. And Zelensky, one of the prongs he'd run on was cleaning up corruption. And Trump wasn't really even inclined to send more military aid to Ukraine unless the corruption issue was solved, and then wanted to leverage all of it with a deal with Russia. He thought he could get a deal.
Explain when you talk corruption in Ukraine, what are we talking about? Because people throw the term out. I don't even understand. I think I understand, but what do we mean?
By most independent measurements, Ukraine is in the top 10 of corrupt governments in the world. You have one of the biggest land masses with all kinds of natural resources in the middle of Europe, and yet it is the poorest nation in Europe. It is one of the only ex-Soviet countries that has become poorer per capita after leaving the Soviet Union. Now, there were some other reasons for that. There were a lot of Soviet leaders that had, after 1960, that had ties to Ukraine, deep ties to Ukraine, gave a lot of arguable favors to Ukraine. Putin has hinted at this. After they broke up, Russia decided to pay back Ukraine's debt that it owed as part of the Soviet Union. So they should have theoretically been much better off economically, but instead they got poorer and poorer and poorer, especially as this EU politics started. And some attribute it to the involvement of third-party NGOs, non-governmental organizations. George Soros made Ukraine a pet project of his beginning in the early 2000s. There's people who are critical of that, who are skeptical of what his objectives were, that often you undermine the independence and wealth of a country to make them a more dependent colony. That the more independent wealth they have, Ukraine used to be a main source of shipbuilding, main source of steel, of aerospace, of engineering, of a wide range, and now it's one of the weakest in Europe. And it's not a coincidence that Putin explicitly mentioned that. It's like if these European allies that you're seeking help you, why is it you keep getting poorer and poorer and poorer the more you ally with them? That's the Russian perspective, which Putin represents and has expressly communicated. But you won't see that repeated in the AP version that says, let us explain to you why Putin is doing this. Somehow that's missing. The 2014 Maidan coup, somehow it's missing. Much of the Donbass dispute, somehow that's missing. Somehow the Minsk Accords somehow never get in there. And of course, in 1990, the United States and the West promised that if the Soviet Union broke up, we would never move NATO east. Given that NATO is historically aligned against Russia. We, of course, broke that promise a few years later, and we've been breaking it ever since. It was never reduced into a treaty, so you can deal with it accordingly. But generally speaking, tying yourself in with lots of treaties is what gave us World War I and a lot of other dumb wars over a historical time period. So we'll see how all of that progresses. But that's sort of the backdrop of what took place and the whole background of what took place. And then you can go further historically in that Eastern Ukraine has a lot of Russians, native-speaking Russians that have more often been allied with other nations than the West, whereas Western Ukraine was at one point, parts of it were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. You'll see a lot of Poles be very anti-Russian. That goes way, way back to the Russian Empire interrupting the great Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Arguably the greatest government in the history of Europe at the time was the Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. Had a lot of democratic components, little r Republican components, etc. And it wasn't just, so the Germans helped with that. And Poland hasn't, forgotten the Soviet Union either, which they attribute to Russia. So there's a historical antagonism there. And often there's been historical antagonism going back centuries over Western Ukraine. So it's kind of a reflection of a long-standing dispute. But the temporary issues are NATO, nuclear weapons, and the 2014 Ukrainian coup. And to your point, when Trump reached out to Zelensky and said, let's clean up corruption, let's clean up some other things that would in turn probably have increased the probability of peace many years ago. Instead, that phone call was used as the basis of deep state operators like Alexander Vindman and others to create the fake impeachment of Trump to prevent peace from happening. Without Russiagate and without Ukrainegate, that second bogus impeachment, there's almost no chance that we're here now where Russia is militarily involved on the ground in Ukraine.